Hi friends, my name is Bhavya Mangla. I'm IATF qualified auditor doing audit for the automotive sector for the last 19 years. I'm again back with a very interesting topic, and today I'm going to talk about the key difference between statutory and regulatory requirement. And by the time this video will end, you will understand what exactly is the meaning of statutory requirement, what exactly is the meaning of regulatory requirement, why they are important for any organization, and what are the key differences between them. When we look around ourselves, we find that we are all surrounded by all these statutory and regulatory requirements, which are also called the legal requirements. When we are on the road, there is a red light, so there is a guideline with respect to that. When we are driving, we have to wear helmet or we have to put a seat belt. In case we are smoking, again there are certain guidelines with respect to that. When we are driving the vehicle, there are certain emission norms that we need to be followed, and there are so many legal requirements with which we are surrounded in day in day out. So it's not only in the industry, but in our day-to-day life also there are so many requirements. As simple as the bottle of mineral water, there are certain guidelines, do's and don'ts that needs to be followed with respect to that. If I talk in context of ISO 9001 and IATF 16949, there are many requirements which are related to statutory and regulatory requirements. In fact, there are approximately 18 different requirements which are stated there. In general, there's a lot of confusion that what is the difference between statutory and regulatory requirement, and majority of the cases they are being used interchangeably, but actually there is a specific meaning to that. But overall in industry as well as in the standard, both statutory and regulatory requirement are termed as a legal requirement. If I give a reference to standard, as I said earlier, there are many clauses where the reference is there. For example, in clause number 4.4.1.2, there is a clause with respect to product safety. So there may be many things with respect to that. It could be seat belt or could be the emission norms. Then there is another clause 75321. It's talking about record retention, that there are certain legal requirements with respect to that. Say for example, whenever an organization is testing their vehicle with respect to Euro 6 emissions, so they have to keep the record for a certain number of years. Something similar is with clause number 8.2.2, which is related to determining the requirement with respect to product and services. So there may be some requirement with respect to ELV, end of life vehicle, and similarly there are some requirement with respect to product design input also. Especially when we talk about clause number 8422, which is talking about statutory and regulatory requirement with respect to the purchased product. So there are very interesting requirements as per IATF. It's about the country of receipt where you are getting the material, then country of shipment where the organization is shipping the material, and the last, the most important, the country identified of destination where actually that product will be used. There are also a legal requirement with respect to the post-delivery requirements also. So if I talk about simple words, when we talk about the statutory requirements, primarily they are more with respect to the laws which are passed by the center and the state. And when we talk about the regulatory requirement, these are all those requirements which needs to be implemented in a certain way. So that's why there is a lot of confusion that whether actually there is a difference between statutory requirement or the legal requirement. Now talking specifically about the key differences between them. So let me start with the definition of statutory requirement. So when we talk about statutory requirement, primarily it's an obligatory requirement which is specified by the legislative body, and it is defined in as per 2015 version. Wherein when we talk about the regulatory requirement, it's talking about the obligatory requirements specified by an authority mandated by a legislative body. When we talk about statutory requirement, primarily it is derived from the legislation that has been enacted through a law. Wherein when we talk about the regulatory requirement, is primarily how to regulate a particular law, especially when a law is created, then how it needs to be enforced. So for that it is being used. In general, again to clarify a little bit more, when we talk about the statutory requirement, it's basically a statute which is often general in nature, not very specific. Wherein when we talk about the regulatory requirement, these are the rules which are being developed to interpret the laws, and they are specifically more clear and more defined that how it needs to be implemented. In general, when we talk about the statutory requirement, it has to be followed by all the citizens of the country. Wherein when we talk about the regulatory requirement, it has to be followed by the citizens of a particular region, say for a particular state or a union territory or something like that. When we talk about statutory requirements, generally it is backed up by some criminal penalties in case there is a non-compliance. Wherein when we talk about the regulatory requirement, generally those penalties are not there. In general, when we talk about the statutory requirements, they primarily provide the framework and overarching principles, wherein the regulatory requirements are more specific rules and the requirements. It's very difficult to change the statutory requirement because they require the legislative action, wherein regulatory requirements can be changed more easily and it's easily manageable. In general, when we talk about statutory requirements, as I said earlier, it's member of parliament who are involved in the execution. While we talk about the regulatory requirement, it's primarily more executed by the lawyers and officials. It takes a lot of time for the execution of a statutory requirement, whereas when we talk about the regulatory requirement, specifically the time is a little bit less to implement that. Now talking about some of the examples with respect to the statutory and the regulatory requirement. When we talk about statutory requirements, primarily, say for example, it's talking about some excessive level of a certain pollutant which may be there near some water body. So there may be a statute which will be defined. Wherein when we talk about the regulatory requirements, so there will be some environmental protection agency which will talk about some regulations, that what is the meaning of excessive level, what is the meaning of major bodies of water, and what kind of enforcement that is required. Say for example, let's take example of statutory requirement wherein it is talking about the educational system which has to be developed. Maybe a country is passing that. But then when we talk about the regulatory requirement, now here they are talking about what are the controls which will be there by the Directorate of Controller, how to implement all those education policies. Say for example, when we talk about statutory requirements as per the Company Act or as per the Motor Vehicle Act, there are certain guidelines maybe with respect to the emission norms. But when we talk about the regulatory requirements, so there may be some organizations like Automotive Research Association of India or ICAT, which defines that how to implement all those things. So for example, maybe there is a requirement that there should be a certain emission norms and it should be regularly checked. Say for example, once in 12 months. Now, different states can define whether they want to keep it 3 months, 6 months, 9 months or 12 months. One very important requirement is that whatever is the guideline which has been given in the statutory requirement, regulatory requirements has to be same or tougher than that. They cannot relax that. So that's something which is very, very important to understand. So in general, if I talk summary, when we talk about the statutory requirements, we are talking about the requirements which are passed by the law, either by the center or by the state. Wherein when we talk about the regulatory requirements, we are talking primarily about all those requirements which are implemented based on that particular legal requirement, that what needs to be done to implement so that it can be effectively utilized in the ground level. Well, my next video will be related to the basic understanding about ISO TS 9002 2016 version. What exactly is that? I'm going to talk about that. Regularly I'm getting a lot of feedback from your side and they're helping me to understand your expectations, so please do continue that. And in case you want to understand a little bit more about this particular video, you'll find a link below. If you click that, you'll find a blog there, and there you will find this information in much more detail. And in case you are liking these kind of videos and blogs, you can always share with your friends and colleagues, and you can subscribe to my YouTube channel and my website bhavyamangala.com. Thank you.